And my podcast, Dear Daughter, is available now. It's a handbook to life for daughters everywhere. Find out more at the end of this podcast.
Being an informed citizen is not always easy. You want to know what's going on, to stay up to date with the big news stories that affect your fellow humans across the planet. But the non-stop deluge of important events makes it difficult to completely understand the headlines. That's where we hope The Explanation from the BBC World Service can help. I'm Anu Anand, and in this series I asked some of my BBC colleagues to help me break down big global news events, using archive recordings made on the ground to make sense of why these stories are important.
There's also, I can tell you now that gunfire is getting very close and people are running towards us, so somebody with some kind of guns coming closer this way.
Today we look at Russia under Vladimir Putin. This is The Explanation from the BBC World Service. Russia was a global superpower during the Cold War. But when the communist era ended, its power suddenly declined. Today, Russia is ruled by President Vladimir Putin, a former spy whose internal repression and external aggression have polarized opinion across the globe.
I've been designated a threat to national security, and as such I'm not allowed into the country.
Today I'm joined by BBC correspondent Sarah Rainsford. She began reporting from Russia just as Vladimir Putin first took over in the year 2000, and she spent more than 2 decades on and off living and working there. But in August 2021, she was expelled.
Apparently, that's it. My whole story with Russia is over.
Stay with The Explanation for the next 15 minutes to understand how Russia has moved from repression to freedom and back again over 3 decades. Sarah, in that video clip, you're wearing a purple face mask, one of those disposable ones. I think you're filming yourself on a phone. Your eyes are quite red and teary. Where were you and what was happening?
I was sitting on a broken bench in the arrivals area of the airport in Moscow. So I'd just been told by the border guards that I wasn't going to be allowed into Moscow and that I was going to be deported from Russia because I'd been declared by the FSB security service a threat to Russian national security, which made no sense at all to me. So yes, I did have red eyes. Yes, I'd been crying because it was just a complete shock. I hadn't seen it coming. Russia had been my home for many, many years, and I was being told I was never going to be allowed into the country again. And my family was there, my husband was there, and my dog.
The country Sarah was suddenly being expelled from had already been through colossal social and political turmoil through the 20th century. Until 1991, Russia was a one-party communist state called the Soviet Union, or USSR. But in December of that year, the Soviet Union collapsed. Boris Yeltsin became post-Soviet Russia's first president. His rule was marked by increasing freedoms, but also economic meltdown.
Today, decades of artificial price subsidies here are being abandoned. Shoppers this morning stared in disbelief at what they now have to pay for the most basic goods. Sausage costs 100 rubles a kilo. That's a week's wages for most people.
I mean, just imagine a superpower breaking apart overnight, essentially. The economic chaos was enormous. The shortages immediately were huge and devastating for people. People lost their jobs, they lost their salaries, they lost the certainty that they'd had for all those decades under one-party rule. So when capitalism came along, it was chaos.
On December 31st, 1999, an aging Boris Yeltsin resigned.
Russia must enter the new millennium with new politicians, intelligent, strong and energetic people, were Boris Yeltsin's last words as president to his fellow countrymen. And already Russia is in the hands of his heir apparent, Prime Minister and now acting President Vladimir Putin, an ex-KGB man plucked from obscurity to run the
government. From the start, Vladimir Putin relied on an image of strength to rule.
He's a judo black belt. He likes to look tough and talk tough too. For example, he says lawbreakers are rats who should be squashed. Russian voters adore him. At last they see a leader who's youthful and energetic, not elderly and frail, and not afraid to show off his body.
But I think the most important thing about him at that time was that he wasn't Yeltsin. He was the antithesis of Yeltsin. Putin came along as this kind of clean living, didn't drink, sporty, physically fit, much younger model who was taking over the reins of Russia. But I think the key thing about him was that nobody really knew what he stood for. You know, he was a grey figure. He was a blank canvas.
But President Putin faced major challenges from the start. In March 2000, a Russian nuclear submarine, the Kursk, sank. Russia declined international help, and 118 crew members died. Russian TV channels covered angry relatives of the dead, confronting an unsympathetic Putin.
He realized the power of television, and he moved very quickly to control that power. Ultimately, I think within about a year of Vladimir Putin taking power, all the three key television channels, which were so powerful, so influential in Russia, were all under state control. And from that day forward, it was a totally different story in terms of the image of Vladimir Putin that the country got to see.
And there was an even deadlier conflict brewing.
The Chechen conflict has become Russia's Vietnam, an unwinnable war of attrition, pitting mountain men against Russian armour. It's bloody too, killing maybe 30,000 a year. And all the time, the mountain men have been dreaming of taking the war to the enemy.
Already, Chechen militants had attacked a theater in Moscow, taking more than 900 people hostage. At least 130 of those hostages died, but not because of the militants. They died from the effects of sleeping gas pumped into the theater by Russian security services. Then, in September 2004, another Chechen attack, this time at a school in Beslan, a town in the southern part of the Russian Federation.
These armed men and women stormed the school. They began firing in the air. They rounded up all of the people who'd been in the playground in the yard, and they shoved them into the school gym. There were explosives strapped to the basketball hoops and planted around the gym. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these children and their parents and their teachers and their grandparents crammed into this school gym. And they had no food, and they had no water, and they had to drink their own urine in the end.
Russian security forces stormed the school on the third day with tanks and other heavy weapons.
Well, I can tell you that there's another heavy gun battle going on here, very close to where we're standing. There have been a series of extremely loud explosions. The line of fire appears to be moving closer towards us, closer away from the school.
333 people died, 186 of them children.
There's also, I can tell you now that gunfire is getting very close and people are running towards us. So I'm actually...
Sarah, did this event have a political impact on Vladimir Putin?
It led him to increase his control of Russia even further. He saw it as an attack on the Russian nation, and his response, his almost kind of gut instinct response to that was to increase his control. So the most obvious sign of that was that he decided that from then on, the governors to all of Russia's regions would be appointed by him and wouldn't be elected.
But it wasn't just politicians who posed a challenge to Vladimir Putin's quest for control.
This is a story of politics, of Russia's most powerful man, and of Russia's most precious resource, oil. It's a story, too, about Russia's top tycoon, multi-billionaire Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Since Saturday, Mr. Khodorkovsky has been locked up in this Moscow jail, charged with fraud.
Sarah, 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Who was he and why was he put on trial?
Well, he was one of the richest men in Russia. He was a man who really benefited and profited from the collapse of the Soviet Union because there was a scheme then which allowed a small number of people to get extremely rich by essentially privatizing the industry that the Soviet Union had run. He took over a bank and then an oil company, Yukos Oil Company, and he got extremely, extremely rich. But he overstepped a line as far as Vladimir Putin was concerned. Putin did a deal with the oligarchs, as they were known, the big businessmen. And he said to them, you keep your money, you keep your business, despite the fact that you gained this business at rigged auctions in a not entirely legal manner. Keep it, it's fine, forget it. But don't get involved in politics. And Mikhail Khodorkovsky challenged that. He ended up on trial for fraud and for tax evasion, and he was sent to prison for a very long time. With Khodorkovsky, it was about sending a strong message to very, very powerful forces in Russia, the oligarchs. I think it was a key moment in Vladimir Putin establishing his control in Russia.
But then, in 2007, Putin seemingly gave up the presidency to a man called Dmitry Medvedev. It later became clear that Medvedev, a Putin ally, was merely keeping the presidential seat warm. He changed the constitution to ensure Putin could run again in 2012. But Russia's political climate was already overheating.
The riot police are now clearing away those who are protesting against Vladimir Putin's inauguration. For those who oppose this presidency, this has been a difficult day.
Sarah, now in December 2011, there's a legislative election, and it's marked by protests, and these protests intensify when the results are announced. So what was going on then? What was happening?
Well, it was a kind of a flutter of political activity that was sparked by that very cynical seat swap between Medvedev and Putin, president and prime minister. People were pretty disgusted by that. And they also saw what they say was widespread fraud at the parliamentary elections in 2011. And they came out on the streets in protest. They were the biggest challenge that Vladimir Putin had actually ever faced. And the context, of course, was the Arab Spring. So the Kremlin was worried about protest. They saw the power of the street and they decided to crack back. And so in May 2012, the riot police were deployed in huge numbers and there were clashes. There was violence at the protest. It was pretty close to the Kremlin. It was a square called Bolotnaya Square. And after that, people who had been arrested and involved in the protests began to be prosecuted. Those people ended up going to prison for several years. And again, it was about sending a signal, selecting a few, coming down really hard against a few as examples for the rest, telling people it's dangerous to protest in Russia. Don't come out, don't challenge me on the streets.
Yesterday evening, an opposition protest turned violent for the first time in recent months as a breakaway group of hardline activists tried to march on the Kremlin. They were met with the full force of Moscow's riot police.
And yet, despite all of this political power being exerted on the public, Putin's biggest critic emerges at this time. Tell us about Alexei Navalny.
He's a lawyer and he was an anti-corruption campaigner, and he was basically a blogger to start off with. He was young, he was charismatic. And in 2011, he was one of the faces of those protests. He was able to capture a crowd. He could really speak to people, especially young Russians. And he used really stark language. So that was the time when he coined the phrase about the party linked to the Kremlin, United Russia. He called them the party of crooks and thieves.
With a huge online following, Alexei Navalny has the power to bring big crowds onto Russia's streets, protesting against the politics of the Kremlin. And his anti-corruption fund has been raided repeatedly by police. It digs into the private lives and finances of the powerful here. Plenty would like that stopped.
For a long time, journalists would ask Alexei Navalny a weird question. They'd say, how come you're still alive? The things he said were very close to the bone. He was going after Vladimir Putin and those close to him for corruption. And he was making videos which were going viral. And the Kremlin clearly didn't like it. And yet Alexei Navalny was still walking the streets, still politically active, until August 2020, when he suddenly collapsed on a flight from Siberia back to Moscow. The plane made an emergency landing, and I think that saved his life ultimately, because he was whisked away in an ambulance. He was given an antidote because the doctors assumed he'd been poisoned. And ultimately, it turned out that that was the case, that he had had Novichok nerve agent used against him, which of course is not the kind of substance that, your everyday folk on the street can get their hands on. So this was clearly an assassination attempt by those very close to power in Russia.
Alexei Navalny's poisoning by a nerve agent was one of a string blamed on the Kremlin. Journalists, dissidents, whistleblowers were all targeted, with agents ranging from radioactive compounds to deadly poisons. And alongside repression of internal critics, Putin's foreign policy was marked by aggression. In 2014, Russia invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, a move condemned by the United Nations General Assembly. President Putin defended the move as self-determination for the many ethnic Russians living there. Not long after, in February 2015, another Putin critic, Boris Nemtsov, was assassinated.
This is a killing that sent shockwaves through Russia's political opposition. Boris Nemtsov, one of their best-known leaders, shot dead right here, just meters from the Kremlin.
This was a time when Russia was being split into camps of patriots and traitors. They used that stark language to talk about people. And Boris Nemtsov was very much for the Russian state. He was very much in the traitor category. And it was a really ugly time. If you're critical of the authorities, then you're against us. You're on the other side. You're enemies.
Do people speculate about Putin the person still? How much of a mystique is there around Vladimir Putin himself?
No, I don't think there's any mystique anymore. I think if at the beginning he was a grey, shadowy figure that nobody really understood, I think, now we all know what Vladimir Putin stands for, and we know what he's prepared to do to get it.
Did you ever understand why you specifically were banned from Russia?
They appear to have singled me out as an example to the rest of the press that we're not as secure as we once thought we were, that we can also be targeted. But I think more broadly, it's just part of the attack on freedom of speech and the free media that we've seen.
Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's the BBC's Sarah Rainsford on the increasingly authoritarian rule of President Vladimir Putin. You've been listening to The Explanation with me, Anu Anand, on the BBC World Service. And if you want to hear more episodes of The Explanation, please subscribe now on BBC Sounds.